I'd like to introduce Pamela Blais, who is our keynote speaker for today. Pamela is the author of Perverse Cities. She is a city planner and principal of Toronto-based Metro. Her professional focus is in creating better cities by integrating planning, economic and environmental thinking in the analysis of urban issues, urban design, and development of innovation policy. She's particularly interested in understanding key forces that drive urban development patterns and how to shape urban form so as to maximize its ability to effectively meet current and future trends. Her approach to urban development issues aims to be strategic and integrated. And today, I think, is going to be particularly interesting for us because Pamela has reviewed our objectives for these workshops, and she has integrated that with some of her thinking, and I think her observations are going to be much appreciated. So without further ado, Pamela.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it sounds like a fantastic project that you're all engaged in. What I'm going to talk about today is, well, sustainable city connections, and I'm going to illustrate the connections by starting off with a few examples of some pretty big disconnects as I see them with respect to our efforts so far to achieve sustainable cities. Okay, what do I do here? Okay, so planning for sustainable cities. I'm an urban planner, so this is the way that I've been approaching this issue for the last many years. And actually going back to about the 1990s in the Toronto area, we planners have adopted the idea of sustainable cities, and we have integrated that into our many planning documents. So our official plans, which are the legal documents which guide development within cities in the Toronto area and in the rest of Ontario. So pretty much since that time, since the 90s, I would say almost all official plans in Ontario, particularly in the Toronto area, have adopted this idea of sustainable cities, sustainable development. And that includes, all of the usual things you would suspect would be included in that. So things like the wise use of renewable resources, a sustainable planning framework. These words that I'm going to show are from one official plan for municipality in the Toronto area that was adopted going back to the 90s. So some of our key ideas are things like fostering vibrant residential neighborhoods. However, when you look at what happens on the ground, I find that the reality of the situation is not always matching up to what our plans are laying out for the area. And again, these are legally binding documents. So these are things that are, development is supposed to follow these initiatives. So this is an area, the photos that I have are within the same area that this plan applies to. And these are new developments. So these are new developments that have just been built within the last 5 years at most. So there's been, let's say, at least 10 years in which to implement these ideas. But, providing a variety of housing options, not too sure about that. Giving priority to public transit. Obviously, public transit plays a really important role in creating sustainable cities. Not sure we're really quite there yet. And giving priority to pedestrians, not too sure about that. Committed to plan for compact and transit supportive communities, using resources efficiently, not sure. So it seemed to me like there was a pretty big disconnect between what we say we're doing and what our plans say we want and what's actually happening on the ground. Now in 2006, as you may know, the province adopted, its award-winning plan for the Toronto region, which is called Places to Grow. And it kind of took these ideas of sustainable development up to the next level. So this applies to the whole so-called Greater Golden Horseshoe, which basically goes from Niagara to Clarington. And so it has many of the same ideas embedded in the plan. Building compact, transit-supportive communities, reducing automobile dependence, creating mixed-use areas, and this idea of creating complete communities, that is trying to put a lot more activities together, so that reduces the need for travel. And they adopted some pretty, for a planning document, particularly at this level, firm targets. So what they said was that 40% of all new units have to be directed to already urbanized land. So they identified an urban boundary. They said that's the urban area. 40% of new units have to be within that boundary in every municipality. And they also introduced some minimum densities, both for greenfields development, for new subdivisions, and also for centers that were supposed to be created. So these mixed-use centers like Mississauga City Center, for example. And so then what happens is, now we have kind of another layer of planning. So that's the supra-regional level. That's places to grow, the growth plan. And now all of the other plans that fall below that have to be amended to reflect those objectives. So now the regional plans, so for York Region, Peel, those have to be amended. And then the municipal plans, so for Mississauga, for Brampton, and so on down to the secondary plan level. So basically, that's what's been happening on this front since 2006. Because it's a planning policy heavy approach, basically the last 7 years have been spent amending plans so that the plans at the local level are in conformity with the places to grow. In terms of what's been happening on the ground, well, for one thing, we don't really know because the province doesn't actually monitor what's been happening on the ground. So they don't, and they haven't been tracking the goals that they've set. So they haven't been tracking intensification levels, they haven't been tracking density levels. And there is a review of places to grow that's coming up for 2014. And whether they will try to pull some data together between now and then remains to be seen. They haven't required municipalities to report on where the growth is taking place within their own boundaries. So we don't really know. Nobody's really keeping track of the development patterns on the ground. The Neptis Foundation, and Marcy is here today from Neptis, well, when she's wearing her other hat, and Zoe, I think, is coming. Actually, they're probably the only organization that I know of that are tracking the regional development patterns. And they just released a study about 3 weeks ago, which looked at the implementation of places to grow. And what they found was that before places to grow, the province projected that if we just kept on doing what we're doing now, the status quo, we'd urbanize 1,000 square kilometers of land within the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And Neptis looked at what's been happening since then under the new plans that have been adopted under places to grow, and found that now the amount of land slated for urbanization is actually higher. So, in other words, if we hadn't bothered to put places to grow in place, we wouldn't really have been any worse off. Some of the other analysis of where the growth has been, this is done by David Gordon at Queen's University, and he's using the StatsCan data to look at population growth in the last census period. And what he found is that, and he's divided it up into active areas, that is areas where it's possible to walk or cycle or take transit areas, transit suburbs, and places that are primarily auto-dependent. And he found that within the last 5-year period, that is within the period since Places to Grow has been put in place, we've added about 52,000 people in active areas, and most of those are in the City of Toronto. In transit suburbs, we've added 26,000 new residents, and in the auto suburbs, almost 400,000. So this is a bit of an issue from a sustainable region point of view. We're building a pattern that's very difficult to service with transit. So now, by 2011, or at the 2011 point, we have 72% of the population in those auto suburbs. That is 4 million people living in auto-dependent suburbs. So when we talk about Metrolinx and their new places, their new big move, plan to introduce transit. That's a pretty big challenge. So as a planner, I'm wondering, okay, why? Why do we have, our plans seem to be all saying the right things, they seem to have the right kinds of policies, but when we look at what are the results, we're getting a big disconnect. And there's a couple things going on that I think are happening here. And one of the big ones is that as planners, we tend to ignore that urban development patterns are really the aggregate result of millions of market decisions, people and businesses deciding where to live, where to buy, where to move to. And that public sector actions play a very significant role in shaping the market, both on the supply side, in terms of what developers decide to build, and on the demand side, where businesses decide to move to and homeowners decide to buy. So I started to look at what are our public sector, and this is just the actions that we're taking and the kind of prices that we set in the public sector. What are our public sector price signals saying? Because obviously the price signals are going to be important in shaping decisions. I don't think businesses or people are oblivious to prices when they're making decisions, particularly important decisions about where to live, for example. And what I found was that virtually all of the municipal financial tools that we have, and we don't have many, maybe that's a good thing, property tax, user fees, and development charges. For those who don't know, development charges are fees that municipalities charge new development to pay for the infrastructure cost that's required to service that new development. And it's usually on a per unit basis for residential. So you pay, or developer initially pays $50,000 per unit, and then that gets passed on in the price of the home, and the final home buyer would pay that amount. And for commercial, it's usually per square meter of floor area. But basically, all of these instruments that we have at the municipal level create incentives to sprawl, and they penalize denser development and redevelopment. And why do they do that? Well, because we forget that pricing urban form and pricing infrastructure is not the same as pricing, a bar of soap. It's different because cities are varied, they have different geographies, and so the costs of servicing urban areas will vary with particularly two things, the location of new development and the density of new development. Those are the key ones. And there's been a ton of research. This is the, basically the cost of sprawl research. This is just a little smattering of some of the findings that shows important relationships between urban form and infrastructure costs. So on the left, there's different kinds of infrastructure. And then what I've done is, so if you look at the bottom bar for roads, for example, some of the studies that I've looked at here show that if you move from a current typical development pattern to one that's more compact, denser, and mixed use, you could save between 20 to 60% of the costs of infrastructure by making that shift. So not insignificant, given that our infrastructure costs are in the billions of dollars. We're even the big move is estimated at $50 billion itself just for transit over the next 25 years. So another way of looking at this, which is how I tend to look at it, this is the kind of premium that we're paying now for having an inefficient development form. So infrastructure costs also vary with location. So if you build new houses, again, in greenfields, that's going to have a different cost than if you build within an already urbanized area where a lot of the infrastructure is already in place. This is, this is from the city of Ottawa, where they actually looked at if we structure our development charge to reflect how the costs vary in different areas of the city, what would they be? And they found that, for example, in the inner zone, it would be about half the cost to service new development as it would be in the new greenfields areas. And actually, I think this is, probably overestimates the cost in the inner zone. So we have a problem when these costs, infrastructure costs, servicing costs vary with location, but the public sector prices that we charge don't, and this is typical. So we put in place a uniform development charge that doesn't matter, if you're building a house downtown or if you're building a house on greenfields, you say that you pay the same development charge, say it's, $30,000 per unit. And so what this does is obviously you're overcharging that inner zone development, and you're undercharging the most expensive to service development by putting in place this average cost-based charge. So you're creating a subsidy. Essentially, the inner zone is subsidizing the greenfields development. So you're getting this kind of wonky outcome where new development in already urbanized areas is being subsidized by the more efficient urban development that makes use of existing infrastructure. So in other words, mispricing in the urban realm is the current norm. And the kinds of development that tend to be overpriced are precisely the kinds of development all our plans say that we want. So it tends to be the denser development, the more efficient development, reurbanization and infill, multi-unit buildings. Those are the kind of cheaper to service kinds of development on a per unit basis. And then what's underpriced tends to be the low density development and the greenfields development. So again, there's a disconnect now between what the finance is saying, what the price signals are saying, and what our planning policies are saying. So pricing is ignored both as an important driver of urban form and transportation, and also as a potential policy tool, because we don't really think of it as a policy tool as well. And just in terms of some of the linkages, for example, one piece of research found that a 1% increase in gas prices will actually lead to changes in urban form over time. A 0.32% increase in inner city population and a 1.28% decrease in low-density housing units. So there's pricing on one side and an impact on urban form on the other. In Melbourne, there's an interesting case because Melbourne is made up of different smaller municipalities, and they use two different kinds of property tax systems. One is called land value taxation, which is widely regarded as one that promotes more efficient urban form. And the municipalities that use that form versus what we would have typically market value assessment, the densities were 50% higher in those municipalities. And looking back at places to grow, I think there is an alternative, or there would have been an alternative to that. If it were me, I would have just put one paragraph in the Development Charges Act that said all development charges have to be based on true costs. And I think that would have had as much or more impact than the whole places to grow thing, and it would have been an immediate impact in terms of our decision making. As it is now, we're still kind of working through the policy on places to grow on the planning side. So the other part of this, that's the pricing side, the other part of it is what are we spending on? Obviously, our spending on infrastructure has important implications for how our cities grow over time. So this is showing what we're spending on transit in Canada as a whole. It's about $7.5 billion for the last year that we have data, and about almost $30 billion on roads. So again, in terms of the sustainable cities idea, if we need to move those 4 million people out of cars and into transit, it's going to be difficult to do if we're spending at a rate of about 4 to 1 on roads versus transit. And actually, this wouldn't include the cost of local roads, because this is just what government is spending on infrastructure, and local roads are not usually paid for by government. They're built by developers and handed over to the municipality. So if we added local roads into this equation, I think the road number would go up quite a bit. In Ontario, the land of places to grow, this is for the last year, looking at where all that money we collect through development charges is being spent. We're spending about $550 million a year on roads, and less than $100 million on transit. And the $100 million is mostly in the city of Toronto. So we're at about 6 to 1 roads to transit in Ontario, at least with respect to development charge spending. So there's this idea that we're spending on one thing, but our spending on the roads may be undermining our spending on transit if we're trying to actually affect a shift from transit to from roads to transit. I think one of the other questions is, what are the limits to planning? And I think planners don't usually ask this question, but I think it's an important one. For example, the market provides some limits to planning. You know, some of the minimum density requirements, you can put a minimum density requirement in a plan, but if the market doesn't support building at that density, it's not going to happen. It has to be something that's market supportable. We tend to not look at some of the global economy factors that are driving our cities and how our cities are changing and evolving over time. For example, you know, there's a drive for efficiency within global companies, a drive for economies of scale, a greater move towards specialization. And all of these things create, I think, some tension with some of the objectives that we're trying to achieve on the ground. For example, you know, some things keep getting bigger and bigger. And as we have those bigger and bigger building blocks, like distribution centers, stores, for example, how do we try to create those and integrate those in an intimate way to create walkable, you know, bike-friendly, more complete communities? That's, I think, an issue, and we're not really talking about those kinds of things. So in other words, I think we really need to try and understand planning and cities in their broader context. And this kind of brings us to a kind of another level of explanation as to why these kinds of disconnects are happening. And, you know, as a planner, I think one of the major reasons is that planning is decontextualized. It's like we just think about, you know, here's a city, I can regulate, you know, the buildings in this city, and that's fine. But we really sort of take out the broader issues about, you know, what are the market and global economic drivers and other drivers that are shaping cities? What are the dynamics? Like, how is that actually unfolding? Because I think we need to understand the dynamics in order to know, you know, where can you have an effective point of intervention? Where is that policy intervention going to actually be efficient and effective? And on the other side, in terms of what are the links between sustainability and urban form, we need to pay a bit more attention to that and look at what's most important. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, in terms of usage, transport is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and is also a growing sector in terms of the total aggregate emissions. And urban form and location are extremely important in determining greenhouse gas emissions, because the location of a building is actually more important than the energy saving features in terms of its overall impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So for the average Canadian household, it's 2/3 of the energy used by that household is for travel on average. So in some cases, depending on where that household is, it could be more, in some cases it's less. But 2/3 of it is for travel. And the other 1/3 is, you know, heating, electricity, and use of appliances, basically. And some of the research that's been done by CMHC, for example, shows if you just move a house, even keeping everything else the same, the kind of house, the kind of urban form that exists, if you move a house from a suburban area to downtown or more central area, you save 36% of greenhouse gas emissions just by affecting that shift. So, you know, there's a very clear linkage between urban form and travel, particularly sustainable transportation. These are some numbers from the Toronto region which make that linkage. So it's the older core, the area around the core, inner suburbs and outer suburbs. The outer suburbs would be the newest suburbs. Actually, the number of vehicle trips per day doesn't really increase that much as you go to the outer suburbs. There is some increase. But what is remarkable, I think, is the amount of travel per day, and that kind of makes sense. So in the core, the average person travels about 10 kilometers a day, and in the outer suburbs, it's about 24 kilometers a day. So you've got those 4 million people in the auto-dependent suburbs traveling long distances, and as we are growing about 100,000 people a year in the Toronto region, if our congestion problems are bad now, I think they're going to get a bit worse in the future. The other reason, I think, is silos, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but from my point of view, you know, what planners do is planners regulate. You know, that's our toolbox. That's what we think our job is. We create, you know, plans and policies and zoning bylaws, and we regulate. Municipal finance people, the guys that create the property tax and that create the development charges, what their job is they raise revenue. And, engineers design infrastructure. But there's important linkages between, in particular, the examples I've given between planning and what planning is trying to do and municipal finance and the price signals that those create. But there's no interaction on the ground between those various groups. So to try and get municipal finance people interested in the unintended consequences of their policies is very difficult. And to get planners are interested in municipal finance insofar as it affects what they're trying to do, but to get them involved in actually trying to fix the problem is also very difficult. But the fact is that there are a lot of different tools that we can use. So for example, with respect to sustainable transportation, we can do the obvious thing, we can invest in transit. That's what you kind of have to do that. But there are other things as well. For example, urban form. You can try to create an urban form and direct growth in such a way that you minimize the need for travel and for transportation. You can price automobile use. You can use tools that enforce cooperation, like carpooling, for example. You can adapt new technologies to manage the system and also to link in with pricing. So the best tools to solve a planning issue may not be what we think of as a planning tool. It may actually be an economic tool. Or the best tools to solve a transportation issue may not be what we typically think of as transportation tools, like transportation demand management, flow management, signalization, lane widenings, and so on. Economic solutions might be an equally or more effective thing to use there. And there are a couple of examples of this, and then I'll close. This is something they've adopted in Kitchener, where they've adopted a really good pricing system with respect to stormwater management. So they've taken it off the property tax, and they have a user fee for stormwater management now, and it's directly linked to how much impervious area you have on your lot. And they've actually kind of measured that across the city to figure it out, and then applied it to the different kinds of developments. And so if you live on in a small house with less impervious area, you pay less. So this does a lot of things. It makes the link between the price that you pay and the thing that's causing the cost very clear, which our current pricing doesn't at all, really, in the urban realm. So now if you're a homeowner, you might actually think, oh, you mean if I have more impervious area, that actually costs more? And it sounds silly, but I think actually a lot of people probably don't make that linkage. So it's good for people who are property taxpayers. It's good for the municipality because now it encourages people to reduce the amount of impervious area. So it reduces the cost to the municipality, which ultimately feeds back into lower cost to the taxpayer. And they've also introduced a credit. So if you reduce the amount of impervious area on your lot, you can get a credit, so you can save more money. So to me, this is a really good example. The other one that I think is kind of interesting on the right here is SF Park, which is San Francisco. I don't know if any of you know about Donald Shoup, who is the parking pricing guru. You'll be excused if you don't know about him, but he's written about a 600-page book just on how to price parking. And what he found was that a lot of traffic congestion is people driving around looking for a parking spot, particularly a metered parking spot, and he actually measured this, and I can't remember what the actual contribution to congestion was, but it was very significant. So he came up with a system working with San Francisco where they monitored parking at meters, and they established a congestion parking price, which would vary during the time of day, such that there would always be 1 or 2 spaces open. So always be in the high demand areas, at least 1 space open, and in the like 1 or 2 streets over, 1 or 2 spaces open, so that people would not be driving around the block 20 times waiting for a parking space to open. So this is a really interesting use of technology, parking pricing, and the urban environment. So just to conclude with my very sophisticated model here, this is, I guess, just how I tend to think of how this all works. So we have urban form and transportation as a kind of key at the center. And of course, that takes place within the context of a natural environment. And the things that are shaping that, I think we really need to identify what are the key drivers. So the market, global economy, those are things I've mentioned. Also, obviously, technology, demographics. There are some, major things that we know that are shaping those relationships and our urban form and transportation. And those, in turn, are really determining our sustainability outcomes on the other side, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or water quality or how much of the natural landscape is being urbanized, those kinds of things. So when we look at our tools, and we have a range of tools, if we have this understanding of what are the dynamics, then I think we have a better chance of making actions and interventions that are effective. And sometimes they can be direct. So I have the one arrow going to the circle. That's kind of the regulatory approach that we as planners tend to take. We just regulate the urban form. But you can also, affect those other drivers. So that would be making changes or influencing the market, which then in turn affects urban form and transportation. And I think with that, I will end.
Any questions for Pamela?
On your pricing for building in urban areas versus suburban areas, did those costs include things of having to revamp infrastructure to accommodate that growth?
Yes, they would. I mean, those are based on real costs. The one that I showed, the blue bar graph, those are based on real costs in the city of Ottawa. And actually, I think that overstates probably the costs in the city of Ottawa. When you get to certain places for example, in the city of Toronto, most cities have capacity in their urban areas, and it's not really an issue. I think in the very downtown of the city of Toronto, in certain areas, you may be getting, because there's so much growth, you may be getting to the point where you have to do things like, expand, the diameter of pipes and that kind of thing. But that can also be costed. So you can add that into the development charge, and that would still be reflected in those numbers. So yes, it would be included.
I was interested in your Kitchener model. Can I reduce my tax if I have the city rip up that sidewalk they put down my line?
In Kitchener? Yeah, I guess you're saying that the city itself is a culprit.
Yes.
In a lot of these cases. Yeah. I agree. I mean, this is a great example for what people can do on their own property. It's true that municipalities are not really getting on board themselves to the extent
the reason I
they
asked is I grew up in the model community, Milton.
should.
We had no sidewalks.
Right.
I lived in a community where I had a sidewalk on one side of my property and nothing down the other side. So all those people on that street did not have a sidewalk imposed upon them. In a suburb where everybody can walk on the road.
Right. I think that this model makes sense, particularly when you get to very large creators of impervious area, like surface parking. So I think for those areas, commercial uses that have large areas of paved surface, I think it's really a great tool because it really points out what is the cost. But you're right. I mean, the whole idea of sustainable infrastructure is one that municipalities talk about, but we haven't really implemented.
Well, these are real common sense approach, not just some one level deciding.
Yeah, engineers are kind of risk averse in the municipal world, so we talk about things like having a swale, like a vegetated swale instead of paved area. They're concerned about liability and very, very cautious. Yeah.
Maybe they could use some of the funds they raise from the taxes for permeable sidewalks, or parking as well. But anyway, back to the basic model. I think one of the tools missing there is something you mentioned at the beginning, which is monitoring.
Yes.
I'm a data guy, and so like if we have the numbers, then you can go to the silos, I think, and say, you know, you have these sustainability targets, and if we have monitoring, we can say you're not meeting your targets.
Absolutely, and if I can make a pitch, we really don't have any data on how the urban form of the region is evolving, and the province isn't doing it. They aren't requiring municipalities to do it. You know, the data is there in municipalities. Municipalities, you know, they process applications, they have unit counts, they know where the development is taking place, but we don't have that at a regional level, which, you know, particularly given the environmental impacts of our region, the scale that our region is getting to, I think that's hugely important to know, you know, where is the growth, what kind is it? Is it, you know, single detached houses? Is it apartments? Is it commercial? You know, even at that kind of basic level, and how dense is it? Really, I think those are some really key things that we would need to know, and the only people that I know that have been doing this are the Neptus Foundation, who have been doing some work on that. But it seems to be ridiculous that we have these policies, put the policies in place, and then we don't monitor.
Yeah.
Right, yes, and just to follow up, you've got some, a great set, and thank you very much for the presentation. You've got some great numbers there that then go back to the point you were making, that nobody really, I think, recognizes, and it really shoots to the heart of the increasing amount of risk that municipalities are facing and don't yet fully understand or have quantified. So these,
The risk in terms of environmental or financial or?
I think
All of the above?
I would think probably all of the above, but if you were to kind of strike at the heart of one of them, mounting financial risks as they expand and they move forward in terms of their planning, because I don't think the relationships, as you pointed out, between existing tools and mechanisms and infrastructure that's being put in is fully being recognized, you know, across the board.
Yeah. There is some interesting work actually being done out west, in both Calgary and Edmonton. In Edmonton, council asked for a study to be done which looked at what are the costs and revenues for new areas being developed. Cost of revenues to the municipality. In other words, when we're building new suburbs, are they paying for themselves in terms of the cost they impose on the municipality, and then basically mostly property tax, the other revenues that they bring in to the municipality. And they studied 17 new areas, and of those, only one paid for itself. And that was one that had a very high proportion of commercial development. So what that means is that in the short term, they're not paying for themselves, and in the long term, when it comes time to replace those costs, it's probably still going to be the case. And the property tax in general, so everybody in the municipality is more or less chipping in to pay for those new suburban areas. But typically, you know, we don't really look at that issue. So when the project gets approved, we don't really look at what is the financial impact to the municipality. Is it something that we can actually sustain, you know, in the short term, medium term, and longer term?
Just one additional thought, the whole notion of, because there is an increase in awareness that we do need to start overlaying this impact of climate on top of infrastructure as well. That would be interesting to take a look at as well, because as municipalities start to overlay this, what that looks like in terms of financial costs is interesting.
In terms of mitigating the impacts of climate change? Or?
I believe many municipalities right now are looking at the next decade in terms of what that stormwater shift will look like with a change in climate. And so billions of dollars are being set aside, the city of Toronto, the city of Mississauga. But that would be interesting in addition to this from a risk perspective as well.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I just want to talk about property taxation in particular, and the So I've actually written some papers on this, looking specifically at market assessed value taxation as a deterrent for sustainable development of all kinds. Both energy efficiency retrofits, you put solar panels on your roof, your assessed value goes up, cuts into your FIT tariff rebate. But sort of looking back at the history of this, it was largely based on the fact that all the property value 150 years ago was based on the productive value of land as farmland. So it was very equitable. The amount of property tax we paid was basically a per acre fee that was pretty much equivalent everywhere. There's such a decoupling of land size and property value now because of urban land values that obviously we're paying a grossly inflated property tax amount compared to what our impact is and what our cost of servicing that sort of high dense community cost. So I really like the stormwater utility example from KW. We use that a lot when we're talking about market drivers for this stuff when we work with developers. What I guess I'm looking at is if market value of land has no relevance to the cost of servicing anymore, what are those other metrics? I mean, stormwater is one of those things that they've decoupled. They've taken it out of property tax and now associated a utility sort of mechanism to that. But this is where I think all this data stuff can really go and break down what are those other municipal costs that we're spending and how do we break those down to a unit value to say, okay, your land size is X, so the capital to service that, the amount of roadways, sewer lines, sidewalk volume is X, the operating cost of that is X, and what are those metrics? Is it just land size and population?
It depends on what the service is.
Yeah.
And a lot of those kinds of things have two components. So it is both the lot size and usage. Right? So with respect to water, part of the cost that a particular lot generates depends on how big that lot is, because that means how much pipe you have out front. And part of it is based on how much you use, so how much water you use. So, for those kinds of things, a two-part charge makes a lot of sense. So you have a kind of standard fee that reflects, the delivery of the actual cost of the network, which is related to lot size. And some of the costs are already broken down this way. For example, when you pay your electricity bill, it's broken down by usage and distribution. It's just that the distribution doesn't reflect lot size.
No,
it's just distribution, so it doesn't matter where you are and how much it actually costs to maintain that network in front of your house. You still pay the same fee, but so that's something that you could actually adjust because it is already broken out. I guess basically anything that's kind of network oriented obviously is going to be responsive to urban form. So it's roads, sewer, water, all of the utilities, transit as well. Not only the kind of capital costs, but also services that are delivered over a network. Like there's research that's been done on, courier services and postal service. It's also dependent. The cost of servicing and delivering to dense neighborhoods per unit is way less than suburban areas. So one of the things is, and I often have a slide in this, is about transportation costs, because for a municipality, road costs are a huge factor. And as you say, property tax, there's no relationship to cost causation. So you could have even, if you took it off the property tax and created a roads user fee, it would be way more accurate. And also it would make, again, the link in people's minds that it's not actually free to drive on roads. There is a cost that's paid by everybody. And it can be very, very simple kinds of taxes, like based on how many cars you own. That which is basic, but it's way more accurate than what we're using now. What is your lot frontage as a kind of maintenance of the road related to the
I think that's one of the big challenges, that psychological concept of what's the value. So if you live in a suburban area where you may be paying relatively high property taxes and not getting very good services, you think you're getting not very good value for your money. And compared to the people downtown who have a subway right outside and have all this stuff. If you flip that away from the value to you as a homeowner to the value expended on those people, you could say, the municipality would say, listen, we're spending $100,000 on transit to your neighborhood and we're spending $100,000 to those guys. It just means that those guys get a subway and you get a bus that comes by every half hour because it costs so much more. So the value of services provided versus the value to the homeowners is so different, and I think that conversation gets lost a lot.
It's certainly true in the city of Toronto, and it's not always true because it depends on the geography of the city, but in the city of Toronto, we have dense, very efficient, very high value properties in the center, but they're high value by virtue of the fact that they're in the center. And then we have lower density, less valued properties in the suburban areas. So the ones that are downtown, they're cost less to service. They're more efficient, they cost less to service. And they're taxed at a higher rate. So it's a kind of double whammy. It's a political issue as well, so in terms of, that's why I think taking some of these services off the property tax, and then reducing the property tax, make it part of a package where people understand, oh, I could actually save money by doing a few things here. Then it could be something that's appealing and politically saleable. But you need a different kind of mayor.
That's coming. That's happening. So first, I just wanted to thank you for a really great talk. I've learned a lot, and it obviously feeds very well into what we're trying to achieve today. So, besides the sort of current decoupling between policy formation and then monitoring data and assessment of outcomes, and I think that's something we want to try to address. So the other thing I wanted to ask you was, so it's interesting how I guess in the private sector, when you have a product, you kind of have to make your price related to your cost, so you won't make a profit, right? But in the public sector, monopolies and so there's decoupling, and that's part of the problem.
So they're just not thinking about that. They're not thinking about the pricing. All they care about is we need to raise money.
Right.
We need money.
Yes, and that's a constant
The
need.
price signal,
And where can we
they
get it?
don't care about it.
Exactly. Where can we get it? So what I wanted to ask you, I think Brampton in a few minutes will introduce our notion of a campus network. So we're interested in using campuses as kind of university campuses and college campuses as a kind of microcosm of an urban environment. So on that theme, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on these problems from that kind of institution's perspective. So these institutions also, to some degree, have a monopoly on at least their constituents, and so they can tariff parking. There's no other parking competitor in their campus, and they're also under extreme financial pressure right now. So at the same time, they are trying to optimize something, and one of the big objectives is the student experience, and try to deliver that. They are competing for students. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on whether things you said today about city planning could be extended. So in terms of parking or organizing public transit campuses and actually planning the structure of campuses, so forth.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I haven't really thought about how all this would apply specifically to a campus. There are, I think, some differences with respect to a campus compared to a regular part of the city. And I think those are something that you mentioned already, that is that a campus doesn't really respond to the same kind of market prerogatives that development in the city does. So, you don't have to necessarily turn a profit on building a building, for example. The development charge thing is usually waived for public buildings. So it's not subject to the same kind of market context as the rest of the city is. So it's different in that sense. The other sense I think that it's different in is because there's a lot of students at a campus. You have to be really mindful of the whole income impact are, if you're talking about pricing and pricing changes and those kind of policy tools, students are not the wealthiest people typically, so there's a kind of regressivity, so you have to be very careful about, how you do that. Which is not to say that there aren't things that you can do. I'm sure there are a lot of things that you can do, but it's not a typical piece of the city.
Yeah.
I think it would be really interesting to look at a typical piece of the city, maybe in addition, or if there's a piece of the city that's adjacent to a campus area, or a different kind of campus, for example, one that is kind of part of, the market economy in a more kind of normal way, one that has a huge impact on the environment. Maybe the area I always think about is the area around the airport in Toronto. It's because there's 3 different municipalities that are around the area. It's very disaggregated in terms of its planning, in terms of the physical planning, in terms of the transportation planning. And it is the second largest concentration of jobs in the region and possibly in Canada for that reason. And it's just completely unplanned and completely disaggregated, but there's so much potential there in terms of all the activities that are going on there, all of the jobs, hotels, everything related to the airport. To me, that would be a really interesting place to look at in terms of urban form transportation and some of the other sustainability initiatives that we could put in place there.
That's interesting because in our technical meeting we did talk about how we start with campuses, we might extend to other kinds of campuses, in quotations like an airport or hospital, which are very large institutions in urban.
By the airport, I mean the airport itself and
the
area that's related to the airport, including all those jobs
Yeah.
that are related to the airport. That would be an area I think that would have a huge impact in terms of sustainability of the region. So it might be interesting to look at the two, so you could compare a kind of quasi-market driven area to a truly market center.
Well, for example, at the York Keele campus, we do have the York University Village, so there's a residential area that's kind of attached to the campus.
Right.
So there's still issues about where area moving around.
Right. Well, that might hold the potential just within your campus to look at the 2 different areas and see what.
So recently heard about project at Simon Fraser University. Forgot the actual name for it, but they've started sort of this whole new notion of campuses by trying to bring actual residences to come and live there in the campus. So I guess it's a greater integration of how we typically understand a campus as this perimeter and how it becomes more integrated into a fabric of what you call the market forces.
Right. Well, I find it very interesting to listen to this because it's totally not my area of discipline. However, I live in one of the fastest growing communities in Canada, which is Milton. And I live right near Tremaine, and on one side of Tremaine there's the escarpment, which is under the biodome protection to a certain extent, so you can't build up to the escarpment. However, just slightly south of the escarpment is slotted for Milton Education Village, which is land that has been donated by Mattamy, the developer in Milton, which has been given to Laurier to build this campus, which of course they have no money yet to do. So they have this large vacant piece of land. On one side is all typical suburb sprawl, very low density, big houses, lots of houses. And then you have the escarpment. So it's interesting as a potential campus study because on one side you have protected natural environment, you have urban, suburban sprawl, you have the 401, and then the 407 is not that far, so you've got paid tolls versus, I think as a model study it could be very interesting because it's already got a lot of inherent challenges right there, which, I know York is different again because it's sort of out there for students to get to, but yes, we have a GO train system, however, it's all destined to go to Toronto, not to bring students in. So I think, I'm waiting to see what will happen with it. And now they're building the velodrome right next to it.
So they're gonna have to get people to develop their own when the Pan Am games kick
They
in.
have similar kind of issues in New York.
Yeah, so I'm just waiting to see how
Yeah.
that plays out.
Well, that gets to the issue of strategic use of public investment in buildings, you know. We're not too good at aligning our own spending that we can control through the public sector when we invest in buildings, recreation centers, like they're all, I shouldn't say always wrong, but very frequently, they're not in a place where you can capitalize on the synergies that those kinds of uses present.
Oh, these are plunked down in farmers' fields.
Right, right there. Right, yeah.
Speaking of opportunities, is that you were mentioning the airport, is that our organization, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, has a program called Partners in Project Green, which is the largest eco-industrial zone in, I think, in North America.
Right.
And I would think that they probably have a lot of data, because they've been operating now for well over 5 years, I think. It might be an interesting case study to see what can be done there with the data that they have, and in terms of changing that area over time. So they probably have a lot of data. So I'm actually going to go back to my own internal organization, find out exactly what they do have, and see what the opportunities are.
That would be I know about that project. That seems like a great project. And to expand that to include transportation and land use, because I don't think they actually looked at that. I mean, I think they're talking about materials and recycling and moving things around. And but in terms of environmental impact, they look at urban form and transportation, to that area, that area's role within the broader region. What is the potential there? Because I think there's a huge potential in terms of strategically adding development, of the right kind and the right place to make. I get so frustrated when I drive through that area because there's so much stuff there. But it's like you have, the makings of a beautiful salad, but all the leaves are on different counters. And how to put them all together in the bowl to make something really amazing. You have all the ingredients there, but they're all, spread out and not connected in any way. And to me, there's a huge potential in that area.
I'm just curious, have you found any place that the community in the city seems to have gotten right, or at least is getting close to getting things right? Are there any good models out there of taking the observations that you've shown to us today and grappled with them in an effective way?
In terms of the kind of pricing issue, yes, there are some. So there's not one kind of model community that's done everything right. There are communities that and cities that are doing pieces. So, there's parking pricing charges in Montreal and Vancouver, for example. Vancouver has a pretty good system of development charges. Within the Toronto area, the city of Markham has a really good system of development charges, which is comprehensive, and it's structured to create density. It's structured on an area basis. It's structured to promote. They're trying to create basically a downtown from greenfields, but it's structured in a way that will support those objectives. The problem is that Markham is part of York Region. So if you do a development in Markham, you still have to pay the York Region development charge, which is not structured that way at all. So, so there's a kind of lack of coordination. The same is true in Mississauga. Mississauga now, they don't have any greenfield land left. So now they're trying to redevelopment and to add more development into the Mississauga City Center and along the corridor where they're planning an LRT. But they're in Peel Region, and Peel Region has conventionally structured development charge. So basically every apartment and every development that's on already urbanized land in Mississauga is going to be overcharged. So there's a disincentive to do that there. But there are examples, individual pricing mechanisms, and as I said, the City of Markham has a really good development charge system that is pretty comprehensive. It's the most comprehensive one I know in Canada.
We have one more question.
Okay.
Jim?
You can have two.
Looking back to Calgary, I noticed somebody here that was very effective. And I'm just wondering if in all this planning, if we brought the Ministry of Transport, because in Calgary, they run the light rail transit right down the center of all the divided 4-lane highways And they got light rail kinds of going out to places where only 15 people live.
Well, I mean, yeah. I guess the idea is that you lead with transit when you get to the outer areas, and that you are able to leverage that transit investment to create density around the transit station and to shape the development pattern. And that is a good idea, and that can work as long as you've got the other ducks lined up in terms of the planning policies and in terms of the financial, incentives. So hopefully that will be the case. In Calgary, they are aware of the issue, and suburban sprawl has become a really big issue in Calgary, which is an amazing thing. And they just had their municipal elections about a month ago, and Mayor Nenshi got reelected in part on an anti-sprawl subsidy platform, and he calculated that it was $4,800 per unit that every house in these suburban areas is being subsidized, and won with I think 72% of the vote. So they are starting to get wet to that issue.
I think they also have a very strong parking policy downtown, that people do not drive as much downtown because of the disincentive in terms of parking down there. It's very expensive. And they've had that in place for a very long time. It puts people on the light rail transit.
Ever have a problem parking myself?
The cost of it is very high.
I just sort of have a question about pricing. You talked about the airport area with different municipalities. One of the big challenges is that we've been cannibalizing each other in the name of economic development. So you have, say Milton discounting its development charges and commercial property taxes to steal businesses away from Toronto. And from a provincial standpoint, or even a national standpoint, that's not really economic development. At the end of the day, you're actually depreciating the economic value. But that's one of the few abilities that a municipality has to drive their job creation is through those financial mechanisms at the expense of their sort of long-term municipal financial security. So I don't know if you've seen if there's any way to build alignment between municipalities in those things like commercial property tax rates, development charges, to prevent that poaching, greenfield sites poaching from existing infrastructure sites.
Well, the province controls the rates that are set for the business education tax.
Yeah.
So, and they have been trying to fix that sort of over time. So, because that is an issue in Toronto, because the business property tax rates are so much less in municipalities around Toronto than they are in Toronto. So that's been one of the drivers of suburbanization of employment. And they are kind of trying to do that and sort of even it out time for transition. Again, I go back to the city of Markham. They have a very different system in place there. And it's a fast-growing suburban municipality. Right next door is, Richmond Hill and Brampton that they compete with, and they're doing so because they have a different vision about what that municipality is, and I think a lot of people like that vision, and so it's competition, but I think it is possible to compete without kind of going to the lowest common denominator of just discounting.
Okay, thank you very much, Pamela. Next up is Brampton.